السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى وجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث. Did he not find you an orphan and give you shelter? And he found you wandering and he gave you guidance. And he found you in need and made you independent. Therefore, for that reason, do not treat the orphan with harshness, nor chide him who asks, and that he speaks about the beggars. But the bounty of your Lord proclaim. This is a message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. This is a message to the most merciful man on earth. It's a message, it's a reminder to our biggest leader. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminding him that as a young boy, he learned vulnerability and he learned humility, and that he not forget that he remembered to look back. And so if the Prophet ﷺ needs to be reminded, what about us? And a huge thing that's very, very, very important to me is self-reflection. It takes a lot to self-reflect. And as Muslims, we learn it from a very young age. It's the essence of spirituality. When you sit down and before Fajr or during Fajr, when you sit after Salat and you make dua, what you're doing is you're self-reflecting. That conversation you have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is self-reflection. You have to look at yourself. You have to look in a mirror and look at yourself prior to talking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's your most humbling moment. And we can't forget that. That's really what prayer is. 5 times a day, you're self-reflecting. You're standing up in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're realizing that you serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's a huge part when you're leading and when you're going out in the community and when you're serving people. How many of you are healthcare professionals? How many nursing, physicians, medical students, paramedics, anything? Okay, so good. We have a few, but not that many. So I believe in teaching via examples. I think it's the best way to learn. I think it's the best way children learn, and I don't think we really grow out of being children all that much. There's always a child inside. So I'm gonna give you an example. I don't like sharing publicly my patients' stories, but this one, when I was thinking about this particular talk, I decided I'm just going to tell a story and you guys do with it what you wish. I wrote this as a third-year medical student, and I keep it and I reflect upon it every once in a while when I start to feel like I serve humans every day, but I realize while I'm serving my humanism is sort of like at the same time dwindling sometimes, and I have to be like, Chifaa, check yourself. Sit down. These are people. They're vulnerable, and it's their sickest moment, and they're tough to handle and to deal with, but they're ill. And you're serving them, and this is what you chose to do. So I'll start my story. Have you ever been pregnant before? I asked. We have been trying for 14 years, she replied, with the biggest smile on her face. She was 21 weeks pregnant with a baby girl, and her pregnancy was complicated by a placenta previa. For everyone not in the medical field, her placenta was in the wrong place. She presented to us with abdominal pain, and we were busy that night, certainly too busy at this particular hospital for a service patient, one without insurance. Therefore, I, as a student, spent the most time with her. I reassured her before we discharged her, sent her home, that the physicians found nothing alarming, and that it could be some round ligament pain, which is pretty common in pregnancy. Take some Tylenol, I said. Let's keep your baby girl cooking in that oven, I joked. My reassurance, while indicated due to our findings, to my dismay was far from appropriate for what came next. and we'll call her Mrs. Z out of privacy. At around 1 a.m. that same day, Mrs. Z was brought in by her husband, hemorrhaging and in extensive pain. Just as a side note, fetal demise prior to 20 weeks of pregnancy is considered a miscarriage. At 24 weeks, any threat of delivery, physicians will administer steroids to help mature the baby's lungs in case of delivery. Between 20 and 24 weeks is probably the worst weeks for any form of threatened delivery. The fetus is viable, yet he or she also isn't. Research has shown that administration of steroids at that age is not appropriate because the baby's too young for such intervention. To many parents, this sounds like a death sentence for their unborn child. Their parents are still left with the decision, however. Do we ask that we do everything for our baby and try to save them? Or do we let our child pass away naturally, a slow and painful death from respiratory distress? So we let parents know these complications, and we let them know that this choice that they have to make. Complications of that baby surviving are things like cerebral palsy, hemorrhage in the brain. So all of the above plus more must be discussed with the parents. One of the biggest decisions of their lives without ever having even seen their baby. And I have watched people make end-of-life decisions for family members in the medical ICU, in the surgical ICU, and this was much harder to watch. As we age, death is eventually expected. Painful, without a doubt, yet expected. However, parents of an unborn child spend months discussing and anticipating not death, but instead life. Therefore, I found it much more difficult observing discussions with young parents of unborn children when presented with the choice of watching their child pass away soon after birth or preparing their child to not have the quality of life that they expected nor wished for. What made this particular case even more difficult is that Mr. and Mrs. Z did not have time. Their decision had to be made while Mrs. Z was screaming in agony at 1 a.m. So in such a circumstance, the obstetrics and gynecology team had no choice. Mrs. Z's life takes precedence over the child's because she was in critical condition. They had to deliver the baby at 21 weeks. So again, it falls between that 20 and 24 weeks. What happens to the baby after delivery, they have to make that choice. So we called the neonatal ICU attending, the physician in charge that night. He appeared and I watched as the residents and this attending argued over who will have the conversation with the patient. It was late at night, they were exhausted. It was a very busy night. They were stressed. And it was a painful conversation to be had. As I watched these physicians argue over who will say what and what will be said, I could not help but think, to these physicians, this was one patient, one busy night, one easy decision. Let's get it over with, is what I overheard them saying. They thought it was a simple choice, so they discussed, there is no use to resuscitate this baby. She's going to die anyway, and even if she survives, what kind of life would she have? They were making subconscious decisions for this patient prior to having the conversation with her and her husband. She was waiting for 14 years to have this child. This was a lifetime. This is her baby, and this night is a night she will remember forever. For her, this is the worst night of her life. It is not a busy night. So after the quarrel, the neonatal ICU attendant goes in, and within 2 minutes, he comes back out. And he's like, that's it, it's done, we're going in. She is a special education teacher and understands that the quality of life her child would have, even if she survives, is not that great. Very dry. I didn't scrub into that C-section. I chose to stand by the parents. I was, after all, the one who told her and reassured her that there was nothing wrong with her. She delivered soon, 475 grams. That was the weight of her baby girl. The first time I felt tears in the OR, as I witnessed her father approach the baby with the saddest of eyes, and as he stroked her, I watched as hope began to spark in them. He rushed back to Mrs. Z, where I was, and said, "Baby, she's beautiful. We can save her. She's trying to breathe. We can try to save her." And Mrs. Z replies, "No, we cannot. She will never be able to say daddy. She will never say daddy." She was going to continue, but she was stopped by the neonatal ICU attending as he interjected and stood between her and her husband, facing only her, and said, "We're still going with this, right? We're not resuscitating the baby?" During one of the most important conversations of their life, as tears flowed down their eyes, this man rushed between them. Just like that, the decision was made. And for the next few minutes, maybe half an hour, we watched as this baby took its last breath. And after that, they went back to discussing who's going to write the postmortem note. Sounds terrible, right? These are the people we entrust our lives with. It's easy when you're not in the healthcare profession to see it as there's a black and white here. There's a clear answer, but there isn't. And as a student, I was like many of you who thought it was an easy decision, and then I became a physician. And I too became stressed, and I too had long nights. And I too would have to self-reflect a lot. And so I bring it back to us, right? Because as Fatima said, before we look at others, we have to look at ourselves. How many times do we scroll past YouTube videos of our dead young children in Syria, in Palestine, the hungry in Africa, drive past the homeless, close our noses in Penn Station as we walk past alcoholics? Why have we become so oversensitized? Because this is what happened to these physicians. They're oversensitized. This is not their first Mr. and Mrs. Z. Is it a mechanism of protecting ourselves? And when does it stop? And how do we fix it? These are the questions we have to ask one another as Muslims. And as Americans, you have to get involved with the bigger picture. Your prayers are very important, yes. Don't stop them, they're very important. But are they all that you're able to provide? And so I leave you with the message of self-reflect. In whatever field you're doing, you serve people. And when you're out there, you're serving people. So don't forget to smile even when you're having the worst of days, because the Prophet ﷺ was always having the worst of days. He had all of us to think about, yet he smiled every single day. جزاكم الله خيرا وأقول قولي هذا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.